If you're applying to graduate school to get your MBA, Master in Management, or other master's degree, and you're preparing for interviews like the Kira Talent interview, there is one mistake that I see applicants make constantly. They spend weeks practicing answers. They practice their tell me about yourself. They practice their leadership questions. They practice teamwork questions. They practice their camera presence. They time themselves. They rehearse. And they feel like they're doing everything right, but their answers are still interchangeable. Polished, confident, not bad, but forgettable. And the reason is because most applicants are practicing answers without getting clear on the one thing that matters most: their narrative. If you're new here, welcome. I'm Caitlin, an Oxford MBA and admissions consultant who has helped hundreds of students win interviews and offers to attend all of the top business schools in the world. I'm also a former recruiter for a staffing agency where I was reviewing resumes and interviewing candidates, and I graduated college summa cum laude and top 1%, first in my class of 1,668 students. So recently I made a video for applicants applying in 2026, and at the end of that video, I briefly mentioned something I call my narrative framework. And someone commented asking me to break it down more clearly. And honestly, I'm really glad they asked, because this is one of the most important concepts I teach my one-on-one students. This is the foundation that makes everything else work. Your essays, your CV, your application form, interviews, letters of recommendation, and even your school list. All of it becomes easier when your narrative is clear. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through my full narrative framework. And by the end, you're going to understand exactly why some applicants sound sharp and impressive, while other applicants will sound vague, even when they're extremely accomplished. Here's what most applicants don't realize. Admissions committees are not listening for perfect answers. They're listening for coherence. They're listening for a person who makes sense. They want to know, does this person have direction? Do they know what they want? Do they know why they want it? And do they have proof that they're capable of getting there? Because graduate programs are not just selecting smart people. They're selecting people who will succeed in the environment and who will actually benefit from their program. So the way that you become memorable is by having a narrative that is so clear that it makes everything you say across all of your application materials look like it fits into a bigger picture. That is how you're going to stand out. So when I say narrative, I'm not talking about your life story. I'm talking about something that is very specific. I'm talking about a structure, a framework. If you want to build a narrative that is memorable, your narrative has to have 4 components: your short-term goal, your long-term goal, your personal attachment to your goals, and evidence. That's it, 4 parts. But here's the key. Most applicants have pieces of this, but they don't have the full structure. And that's why their answers sound vague. So let me break down each part. Your short-term goal is what you plan to do immediately after you graduate from their program, and then for the next maybe 5 to 10 years of your career. And for my students, I make it highly specific. So that means we name one company, one role that exists at that company, the department, the role they want to get promoted to, the function, which is what they'll actually be doing in that role and the role promoted to, and the location, a city that they want to be based in. Now, I know there are many schools of thought on whether you should get so specific with your goal statements. The reason I have my students get that specific is because of the powerful message it sends to admissions committees when you are that specific. It first shows them that A, you're capable of doing a deep level of research on the companies within the industry you're interested in, and B, you're capable of committing to one. That is a powerful message to send to an admissions committee that is wondering, are you going to be willing to commit to them? So when you say in your application that you want to work for this specific company doing this thing in this city, it sends that message that you are someone who will commit to one company, one university. So with this in mind, I want to clarify that I don't have my students list all of those specifics for the short-term goal, because we don't usually have that many words in the essay that we want to spend on that, or we don't have the time in our answers in an interview. So as long as you get 3 or 4 of these specifics, then your short-term goal will be good to go. So the 2 mandatory ones are the company name and the role. You can decide on the department whether you want to mention that. You can mention the city, I usually do, and the role promoted to. But across all my applicants that I'm helping, they're not all listing all of those specifics. So the short-term goal is not your dream, okay? It is what is going to set you up to achieve your dream goal, which is going to be your long-term goal. So it's going to be a natural progression that will give you the skills, the knowledge, the network, everything you need to set you up to achieve your long-term goal. So it's not a vague statement like, I want to go into strategic consulting, or I want to go into finance. Those are not short-term goals, those are fields. So it needs to be specific enough that admissions committees can actually picture you. Because if they can't picture you, they're not going to believe you. So instead of saying something like, I want to go into finance, you need to be able to say something like, I want to join Morgan Stanley as an impact associate in their wealth management global investment office in New York City, so I can gain experience with impact investing. Or, I want to work for Google Cloud as a product manager in their healthcare data engine department at their headquarters in Mountain View, California. Within 3 to 5 years, I hope to become a senior product manager. Or, I aim to rejoin McKinsey as an associate in their London office so I can work on sustainable supply chain projects and train to become a global managing partner. Now, oftentimes I get students that ask me about flexibility and adaptability when I tell them how specific to be with their short-term goal. And they worry that if they're so specific, that it's kind of putting them into this corner that the admissions committee is going to think they're not able to adapt from. Now, the reason you don't have to worry about that is because if admissions committees want to know that you are adaptable, then they'll ask questions about your backup plan, or what's your plan B if this doesn't work out. So that would be like a supplemental essay, or it would be in an interview. They'll ask you, well, if your first plan doesn't work out, what are you going to do secondary? And the way I approach that with my students is I tell them, you're going to get very specific in plan A, and then create a very specific plan B as well. And that approach gives you the best of both worlds. You are adaptable, and you're also capable of making a specific plan. Now, I know some people are uncomfortable with that level of specificity. They think, what if I change my mind? Or what if I don't get that job? But that's not the point. The point is not that your future must be locked in forever. Admissions committees are not asking you to do that. What they want to see is if you are capable of doing something that most people don't do. Research, decide, commit. Because if you can research deeply enough to identify a specific company, a specific role, a specific function and location, then it sends a message. The message is this person is serious. And more importantly, this person is capable of commitment. And if you can commit to a short-term career goal, then admissions committees will believe that you can commit to their program. And that is a huge part of what they're evaluating. So the short-term goal is not just a career goal. It is a signal of maturity and confidence in yourself. Now, your long-term goal is the bigger direction that your career is going. It's what you're gonna do 10 to 15 years after you graduate from the program. So within your long-term goal, there are going to be two important subcomponents. You've got the professional side of what you want to do with your career, and then you have a cause, which is going to be how you plan to use your professional skill set to improve the world in some way. Because admissions committees do not care about people who do not care about the world around them. Now, as you can see, the cause touches every one of the 4 parts of the narrative framework. So I'm going to explain it in a little bit more detail later on. So the long-term goal is where most applicants will start talking in a way that sounds impressive, but is actually very empty. They'll say things like, I want to be a global leader, or I want to make a huge impact, or I want to drive innovation. So admissions committees will hear that and think, okay, but what does that mean? Because anyone could say something like that. So your long-term goal has to be specific enough that it sounds feasible. Now, it doesn't need to be as specific as the short-term goal in terms of naming a company, or naming a department, or a city. But it does need to be specific in terms of the structure of the entity that you either join or you start, and the role and function that you're gonna take there. Now, usually I have my students also mention a general region within the world that they would like to focus on serving. A long-term goal might be, I want to start a social impact fund that invests in the education sector and supports Vietnamese orphans. Or, I want to become McKinsey's first female global managing partner and develop a sustainability-focused supply chain knowledge platform. Notice how those goals have ambition and structure. When your short-term goal is that clear, it creates this feeling of trajectory, and trajectory makes you sound like a future leader. Now, this is the part where most applicants fail, because the personal attachment is the part of your narrative that answers the question, why do you care? And this is what separates a candidate who sounds qualified from a candidate who sounds unforgettable. So your personal attachment is going to be a transformational moment or era in your life, could be from childhood, could be as a young adult, could be a year ago, that will prove to anyone who listens to your story that you really do care about the cause that you're going to mention in your long-term goal. This transformational moment could also include a reason why you care about the professional side of what you want to do with your career. Now, most people don't have the transformational moment that connects them to their cause and to their professional interest. So usually it's going to be for the cause. Now, if your school in the essays or in the interview asks you why you want to be an accountant or why you want to go into finance, for instance, then that's when knowing that moment that you became passionate about finance or about accounting is going to be really valuable. So you may not have talked about it in your essays, but then maybe they ask you about it in the interview. So having those two stories, whether they're separate or they're the same story, is going to be very important for you. So the reason the personal attachment story or stories are so important to your narrative is because admissions committees are not just selecting for your skills and your IQ. They are selecting for your motivation. And they're not looking for surface level motivation. They're looking for deep motivation. That motivation will still exist when the program gets hard, when your workload becomes intense, when you're tired, when you get stressed, when you're in a new country, when you're doubting yourself. So your personal attachment is the emotional anchor of your narrative. It's the reason your goals make sense. And when you get this part right, you stop sounding like someone who simply wants a degree, and you start sounding like someone who is building a career with intention. And by the way, this is the part that makes your interviews feel more effortless, because when you know why you care, you'll automatically sound more confident. Okay, now I'm going to tell you the personal attachment stories that worked for the 3 students that we've been using as examples in this narrative framework video. So our first student, her long-term goal was to start a social impact fund that would invest in the education sector and ultimately support Vietnamese orphans in gaining access to an international education. Now, her personal attachment story that obviously connects her to this long-term goal was that she grew up in Vietnam. She lost her mother when she was 6 years old. And so her father had to raise her and her siblings by himself, and it was a very hard financial burden for him. So when it came time for her to want to get an international education, she had to win a full ride scholarship to a university in a country that offered it, and she did. So you can see now she wants to give other Vietnamese children who have lost parents the same access that she won for herself. That's a very clear connection to her long-term goal. Our second student, remember, wanted to create a health tech firm that would build preventative care products for type 2 diabetes patients. So his personal attachment story was that his beloved grandmother passed away from type 2 diabetes complications. Now, this was despite the fact that she had been surrounded by the healthcare industry her whole life. Her husband was a surgeon and her 2 children became doctors. So you can see why my student had a very strong connection to his grandmother, loved her so much, and then she passed away from the inability to manage her type 2 diabetes well enough. Now, our final student, remember, she wanted to become the first female global managing partner for McKinsey, so she could develop this knowledge platform that would allow the consultants to make better recommendations to improve the sustainable supply chain practices of their clients. Now, her personal attachment story was in the years prior to joining McKinsey, she was working with a different company that was consulting for luxury brands in the fashion industry. She was in a meeting with one of the executives of one of these brands, and the executive said, "Can you smell that?" And she said, "What?" And he said, "Come here," and walked her over to the window where she looked out, and there was a pile of luxury purses burning. And she couldn't believe this was how they were disposing of the inventory they couldn't sell. He said, "Well, we can't sell this inventory, and if it goes to the black market, then it lowers the brand value." And she was horrified. She couldn't believe that this company was doing that. And so it made her want to improve the supply chain practices for large companies. Now, the fourth part is evidence. Now, this is the proof that your narrative isn't just a fantasy, because your narrative can sound really good, but the admissions committees are still wondering, do we believe this person? So the evidence is your proof that you are already on the path that you're telling them you want to go down. So it can come from different places. Could be your major, bachelor's thesis, internships, jobs, projects within your jobs, extracurricular activities, volunteering work, certifications, technical skills, and research. The key is that whatever your evidence is, it has to be featured on your resume and in your application form. And you should feature it in your interviews. For your narrative to be credible, you'll usually need at least 2 or 3 pieces of evidence on your resume that prove you actually care about the goals you're going to tell the admissions committees that you have. Now, if you don't have that evidence, you have two options. You can go out and get some, start volunteering, ask your boss to get on a project that's related to your goals, or etc. Or you change your goals, but you have to have evidence. If you don't, then why should the admissions committees believe anything that you're telling them about your short-term goal, long-term goal, or even your personal attachment story? Admissions committees expect to see consistency in your background in some way. And if you show them that you've been consistent, that will build your credibility. Now let me show you why this matters so much. Because once you have these 4 parts, something powerful happens. You stop sounding like someone who is just answering questions, and you start sounding like someone who is revealing a strategy. So let's imagine that you're in the Career Talent interview and they ask you, tell us about a challenge you faced. Now, most applicants will answer with a random story. They just pick something that happened at work, and the story is fine, but it doesn't connect to anything. It's just a story. But when your narrative is clear, then you can choose a story that reinforces your evidence, or points to your goals, or reveals your mindset. And that leaves the admissions committees thinking, oh, this person makes sense. This person has direction. This person has thought deeply. This person is building towards something. And that creates the feeling that you are ready, not just qualified, ready. Let's give you a simple example. Let's say that the applicant wants to say something like, I want to work in management consulting at one of the top firms. Eventually, I want to start my own firm. And that's essentially the extent of their career plan. So that is very vague. But if we build with the narrative framework, it would sound something like this. Short-term goal. I want to join McKinsey & Company as a senior business analyst in their Vienna, Austria office so I can support projects within the education sector. Long-term goal. I plan to create an edtech firm that will bring education access to children in rural villages in China. Personal attachment. I am a first-generation college student. While I was born and raised in Austria, my father was raised in rural China, where the closest school was over 100 kilometers away. Through annual visits to his village, I developed close friendships with the children there who did not receive the education I was receiving. I vowed to use my career to help children like them gain access to education. Evidence. Number 1. I co-founded a business and finance club at my university to give the Austrian public access to financial education. Over 2 years, it grew to over 100 members and became a nationally recognized club. Number 2, I am a 1-1 first class honors student, and I have very strong academic references. Now compare those 2 versions, the one without the narrative framework and the one with the narrative framework. Same person, same background, but one sounds like the average individual while the other is one the admissions committees will imagine succeeding. That's the difference that a strong narrative can make. Now let's talk about this elusive cause that needs to feature in each one of the 4 components of your application, but will feature most prominently in your long-term goal. Okay, so the cause is something that is wrong in the world that you want to use your career solving. Now, I'll give you specific examples of causes that have worked for my students in the past. Environmental sustainability, financial education, education access, women's empowerment, healthcare access, healthcare improvement, small to medium-sized enterprises and/or traditional business empowerment, international relations and foreign investment in emerging economies, disabled and elderly empowerment, country rebuild. and job creation in emerging economies. Now, there are many more problems in the world, but these were some of the causes that I've seen my students consistently go to over the years. So here's what I recommend you do next. You start by writing out each one of the 4 components of your narrative. Write out your short-term goal, long-term goal, your personal attachment story or stories, and list the pieces of evidence that you have on your resume proving that you care about the goals you're going to tell admissions committees about. And then ask yourself, does this make sense? Does it sound specific? Does it sound believable? And if you can't answer those questions confidently, it doesn't mean that you're behind. It just means that you've identified the work that you need to do. Because once you get your narrative to be clear, then everything else feels easier. Your essays will be easy to write, your interview answers will come naturally, and even your school list will make sense. And you'll start to feel like you're not guessing. So that's my full narrative framework, the short-term goal, long-term goal, personal attachment to your goals, and the evidence. Now, if there's any part of this narrative framework that didn't make sense to you, then please tell me that in the comments below, and I'd be happy to make another video that explains that specific part. So if you didn't fully understand the evidence or the cause, then let me know in the comments and I would be happy to make a new video on those topics. Thanks so much for spending time with me today, and I'll see you in the next video.